Hey everyone, and welcome back to our city, Lakewood. Unfortunately, this might not be such a great day for our city, as this episode is going to be about disasters. We're going to talk about the different types of disasters, disaster services, and go through some steps on how to survive and recover from a disaster that has struck our city. Check out the timestamps down below for the different topics within the episode, and I hope you enjoy the video. Assuming you have the Natural Disasters DLC and Disasters turned on, the types of disasters that you might encounter are visible in the Landscaping and Disasters menu under the Disasters tab. Now these types of disasters are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to talk about them in detail. The next thing are disaster services that are in the Emergency Services menu under the Disaster Services tab. Now as you level your city, first disaster services that you will encounter are the Disaster Response Unit, Small Emergency Shelter, and the Short Radio Mast. The Disaster Response Unit is responsible for sending out both vehicle and helicopter emergency teams to rescue your citizens from buildings and structures that have been destroyed by a disaster. Your citizens will retreat to the Small Emergency Shelter in the event of an evacuation, and the Short Radio Mast will broadcast the evacuation order to your city. The Disaster Response Unit has a limited number of vehicles to send out, so depending on the size of your city and the type of disaster affecting it, you may want to have multiple units spread throughout your city. I usually have all but one of my disaster response units turned off during regular play to avoid the financial cost of having them run continuously, and then enable them when the city is about to be struck by a large disaster. I leave the one response unit on all the time in the event that there is a small disaster that would be needed for. The Small Emergency Shelter has limited supplies, capacity, and coverage, and the Small Radio Mast has a weak signal that doesn't travel very far. As you expand your city, you will need to make sure that there are multiple emergency shelters and radio masts to provide sufficient coverage. Eventually, you will unlock larger and taller versions of the emergency shelter and radio mast that provide more capacity and coverage. The next set of disaster-related buildings will periodically unlock as you level your city. These buildings are designed for disaster detection and unfortunately do not help prevent any of the disasters. Their purpose is to give you enough warning to make sure that your city is prepared for whatever disaster is about to strike. Now, just like disasters, what these buildings do is pretty obvious. The only thing that you need to worry about is making sure that your city is covered by the disaster detection services as you expand. There are a couple other things that you can do to help your city guard against some disasters, and one of them is the lightning rods policy. So if we go into the policies window and then we go to the city planning tab, there is a lightning rods policy that we can enact. And what that does is it reduces the chances of your buildings catching fire during a lightning storm. The other things that we can do is we can actually go back into the Landscaping and Disaster menu, and we can go to the Water Structures tab, and we can actually install some flood walls and canals around our city to help prevent flooding.
The Coast Guard is warning of a tsunami approaching the area. Residents should avoid roads and waterfronts.
Once we get a warning about an impending disaster, the first thing that we need to do is to pause the game. Not only do we get an audio warning, but we also get the disaster information window that will pop up in the top left-hand corner. This will tell us the disaster that's going to strike our city, as well as its intensity. So for us right now, we have a tsunami with a maximum intensity of 10 about to strike our city. We also have this icon in the middle of the striped area, which we can click on, and that will generate a disaster risk map for our city and will show us the areas that will be affected the most. Now, as expected, because this is a tsunami, the areas along the coast will be hit the most. And unfortunately, this doesn't paint the whole picture for us. Because this is a tsunami, I'm expecting the wave to continue past the coastline and actually sweep across our entire city and cause a significant amount of destruction. If this were an earthquake or a meteor, those types of disasters are a little bit more confined. And as long as they're within our disaster detection areas, our disaster services will tell us exactly where those are going to strike, and if we're lucky, they may not even be within city limits. We can also take this opportunity to take a look at some of the emergency services that we have within our city, specifically the disaster response units, emergency shelters, and radio masts. So if we go back down to emergency services and we click on either one of our shelters, we will see the coverage that we have within our city. So we can see that most of the roads within our city are green, and we have lots of these purple icons showing up through the city, showing where all of our emergency shelters are. What we can also do is we can actually go to each district. So if we go to Fairview Park, Near the top right-hand corner, it tells us the population that is within this district, and we are just under 30,000. And we do actually have 4 of these large emergency shelters, which has a capacity of 10,000 each. So we actually have more than enough capacity to support the citizens within that district. And so I've actually done that as I've been going, and I do know that each district that we have within the city has enough emergency shelters to support the population within each one. Another thing to look at, as I mentioned, are the radio masts. And we can see on our map here, the areas that are in kind of turquoise blue are areas with good coverage, high coverage, and good signal strength. And so once you hit the evacuation order, those areas will get the evacuation order the quickest, and your citizens can start heading to their emergency shelters. Now, the university campus is maybe a little bit light, but it's actually not that bad for right now. And lastly, we have our disaster response units. So if we click on that, that will highlight all the disaster response units that we have in our city, and right now it's actually only 1. So I'd like to actually put in a couple more. So depending on the type of disaster and the amount of destruction that you're expecting, you can kind of put in a couple more disaster response units right now, just to make sure that once the disaster hits, that you have enough coverage to go and rescue your citizens when the disaster strikes. So I'm going to put in a couple more right now. These are just going to be temporary, just for this disaster really, to make sure that we have enough coverage. And in the event that one of these is destroyed, there will be plenty of extra to be able to send out more rescuers for our citizens. Now, another building that I'd like to put in here, it's not technically considered an emergency service, is actually a vac trucks, hydrovacs. So if we go to Water, Sewage, and Heating tab down at the bottom, and we scroll to the end, we can see a building called a pumping service. Now, because this is a tsunami that's about to strike our city, I'm expecting a significant amount of flooding. Now, flooding does cause some issues for our citizens in that it blocks their routes of travel. So, and if the roads are flooded, they are unable to travel along those roads. So it's going to disrupt not only our citizens going around the city once they either are released from the emergency shelters, or they're still trying to get to their emergency shelters and the road is flooded, but it will affect all the other disaster response services and things like that from moving around our city and cause even more trouble for us. So I'm going to put a couple of those in here. I'm actually going to put, I think, 3. I think that'll be enough. 3, I think, sounds pretty good. Now, I typically don't have these most times because they're actually very expensive to upkeep. If I click on one right now, it's about $1,600 a week. So you can either wait until your city's about to be struck by a disaster and then just plop a few in there, or you can actually have them in your city and just have them off. It's pretty much exactly the same thing. So now that we have them in here, just hook them up to our water infrastructure. And lastly, another thing that I like to do is I like to try and save money. Unfortunately, some of the best and some of the worst advice to give for a disaster is to have lots of money. You're going to find that, especially once you hit the evacuate all button, you're going to start losing money quick. And if you don't have enough money to start repairing some of your essential infrastructure for your city, it's going to be extremely difficult to recover. So right now we have almost $14.5 million. So I'm honestly not expecting any issues with money at all. But if you did not have enough money, it's important that you make sure you start saving money as soon as possible and that you start rebuilding your essential infrastructure as soon as possible as well. So what we can do is we can actually go into our economy panel down at the bottom and go to budget. And so there are lots of things that we don't really need or we can live without for a little while. So we can actually reduce the budget of our road maintenance. We can reduce the budget of our garbage collection, education. Once we hit the evacuate button, all of our citizens are going to be going to the evacuation shelter. They're not going to be going to school. So we can reduce our budget on that. We can reduce our budget on parks, unique buildings, and also industry areas. Hopefully nobody's going to work in the middle of a disaster unless they are our emergency services, which I will keep up. I'm also going to keep up our water and electricity. and as well as our public transportation. So I'm expecting that it's a possibility that some of our citizens are still going to be traveling around and trying to get to emergency shelters. So I don't want to limit them from doing that. So I'm going to leave those budgets up for right now. Now, unfortunately, on the flip side, the downside to reducing the budget of everything is we're actually going to reduce the land value of the houses around those areas. So because we were reducing the budget for things like schools and parks, their radius of influence is significantly smaller than what they would normally be, and so the land value of a lot of these houses are going to start to drop. So you're going to get people who are going to start to complain about that, and the longer you have the budget reduced, the more likely that they are to abandon their house. So not only are you going to lose citizens from the disaster itself, but you're also going to lose citizens from them actually abandoning their buildings because they don't like the low land value that you've actually put on them. So it's a little bit weird. I guess you're saving their lives, but they don't like that you're reducing the land value of their house. So I think for me, I would I would have to just live with it, and we'll get new citizens, and we'll just continue on without having to worry about it. And so I think for now we are actually ready to unpause the game. And for Tsunami, it's really slow. The little section that I showed you right before of the wave coming into the city is actually sped up almost 2,500%. So it's actually quite a bit slower than that. So I will, before I unpause it, I guess the last thing we need to do, if we go back up to the disaster information window at the top left-hand corner, this little figure that looks like he's running is the evacuate all button for our citizens. So once you click that, the evacuation horns will start to sound and citizens will start to make their way to the emergency shelters. At that time, the resources within the emergency shelter will start to dwindle. So you need to make sure that, it's kind of weird, you need to make sure that you don't tell them to evacuate too soon and you don't tell them to evacuate too late. If you do it too soon, they'll run out of supplies and they'll actually start to die within the emergency shelter. But if you don't do it soon enough, then the disaster comes and they get hit. So it's kind of, you kind of have to hopefully get the right timing on that one. If we actually take a look at the disaster risk map again, if we take a look right now, it doesn't look like much, but it will also show us, once we actually hit the evacuate button, it will show us which of the buildings have been evacuated. So we kind of get an idea of the citizens, where they are, what they're doing, and see if they're safe actually. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to evacuate everybody and I'm going to unpause the game. But unfortunately, I cannot record and evacuate everybody at the same time. My old 4-core processor, it struggles a lot when I do that. There's too much going on, lots of citizens doing lots of things. So I'm sure most of you will find the same thing, is that your game slows down quite a bit when you hit the evacuate button. And so I unfortunately cannot record when that is happening. But what I'll do is I will unpause it and play it for a little bit. And then at each stage of the disaster and the disaster recovery, I will pause the game again and start recording and kind of explain everything that I usually do and give everybody some tips and tricks that I have learned and hopefully be able to recover from this tsunami. The tsunami is about halfway through our city right now, and as you can see, there's still quite a bit going on. If we take a look at some of the icons that are popping up throughout the city, we can see that we're starting to have issues with our city services. Now this was expected, as the flooding is actually preventing some of the city service vehicles from reaching their destinations. But unfortunately, there's actually nothing we can do about that right now, other than to wait for the water to recede, or to wait for the pumping service vehicles to actually clear the water from the roadway. Zooming in, there are actually lots of issues with flooding and collapsed buildings. The flooding is shown by the red icons with the blue buildings that look like they're underwater, and the collapsed buildings are the gray icons that look similar to the abandoned building icons. These collapsed buildings will be visited by our disaster response units, and you can see that we actually have a couple helicopters hovering above, getting ready to land and look for survivors. Now, despite being underwater still, some of these buildings have been searched. Zooming in a little bit, we have a few icons here, disaster response unit icons with a white background. Clicking on the building, it will show us that it is ready for rebuilding. Now, buildings like this will actually rebuild on their own as the demand for that building type increases, so we don't have to do anything with them right now. So we will leave our disaster response units to continue searching for survivors. But what we can do, what we can actively do while we're waiting for the tsunami to pass through, is we can go and we can actually look for these buildings like this one here that has the disaster response unit icon with the red and orange background. These buildings have also been searched by our disaster response unit, and if we click on it, it also says ready for rebuilding. But the main difference here is that we actually have to manually rebuild these buildings. So these buildings are the essential buildings for our city, such as education, police, ambulance, fire, public transportation, and electricity, and sewage and water, things like that. So taking a look down at our funds at the bottom of the screen, we can see that I'm losing about $100,000 a week, and I think we've lost about $800,000, maybe $1 million so far. So it's quite a bit, but considering how much money we started with, it's really not that much. But if your city were to have lower funds than what we started with, it's very important that you go around and actually rebuild all of these buildings as soon as possible. Now, because they are essential services for your city, if you don't have any money to rebuild them, it's going to make it extremely difficult to rebuild the city. It costs you nothing to rezone areas such as residential and commercial, but like I said, if you have no money to rebuild the essential buildings that you've already built, such as your police, fire, education, things like that, it will make it quite a challenge to get your city back up on its feet. So we'll go through and we will just click rebuild on all of these buildings. I know a lot of them are still underwater, so they may get destroyed again. I'm not really sure if flooding collapses buildings or it was actually the wave itself that went through and collapsed these buildings. But I think while we can, we might as well rebuild as many of them, and then we don't have to worry about them in the future, or if they do collapse again, it's really not that big of a deal to rebuild them quickly. So there weren't too many right now, but as I said, the tsunami is only about halfway through the city, so we still got a little bit of water to come through before we are totally out of the woods. And unfortunately, as you can see here, some of the disaster response unit buildings that we did put in did not survive the tsunami that came through. So it's very good that we actually had a number of other disaster response unit buildings that we put in over here. And what we can actually do is we can actually go back to our budget. So if we go back into the budget economy window here, we can actually go into the emergency services right here, and we can actually increase our budget. So now that the tsunami has struck our city, by increasing the budget of our emergency services, it actually increases the number of disaster response units that are available for us to send out to our city. So despite having two less buildings over here that were destroyed, we can actually increase the number of rescue units that will go out by increasing the budget. And for now, I think that's about it that we can do at this stage. So as I said, it's very important that you go through your city as the disaster is going through, and that you actually look for the buildings that can be rebuilt while you still have funds to do so. So I'm going to let it run for a little bit longer, and I will meet you back in a minute for the next stage of recovery for our city. The tsunami's just about finished passing through our city, but we still have quite a long road to recovery ahead of us. I've been going through and manually rebuilding all of the buildings that I could find, given that we still have the budget to do so, but we're starting to see lots of abandoned buildings due to lack of city services and low land value. Given the amount of flooding and the budgetary restraints that we had put on our city at the beginning, this was kind of expected. But now that the disaster is just about through the city, I think it's about time that we put our budget back to where it was, and actually I'm going to put it a little bit above what we were at before. I'm going to put everything to about 125% in order to try and resolve some of the issues that we have sooner. Our emergency shelters are actually starting to run out of supplies now, so it's about time that we start sending our citizens back home. The danger that they're going to face coming out of their emergency shelters is actually quite low right now. There looks like there's maybe a little bit of flooding still, but really not that much, so I don't have any issues with starting to send them home. I've actually also put in a couple more of these disaster response units throughout the city to try and speed up the process of searching through the collapsed buildings for survivors. So I'm going to do that now. In the top left-hand corner, back to the disaster information window, the little running guy that was here before to signal the evacuation for our citizens has now turned into a little green house. So once we click that, that will send all of our citizens back to their houses. So I'm going to do that off camera again because we will have issues recording when I click that button. So I will meet you back here shortly and show you what's going to happen next. The tsunami has finally swept through our city, and the annoying announcer lady telling me that the tsunami has struck the city has finally stopped, so I'm pretty happy about that. And what we have to worry about now is rebuilding and stabilization of the city. Taking a look at our budget, we can see that we're now losing $165,000 per week, and we've actually dropped below the $10 million mark in our bank. So we want to make sure that we try and stabilize that before we run out of money. And one of the things that we can do is we can actually go back and remove or delete some of the services that we added to help deal with the disaster striking our city. And primarily what I'm talking about are the disaster response units. So none of these buildings are actually in use right now. We can see there's 0 out of 13 or 0 out of 4 helicopters. So I can actually remove all of the extra disaster response units that I added in. And I did add in quite a few. So the recovery process was a little bit quicker given the number of rescue services that we had available to the city. And I'm going to leave in the one original disaster response unit that we started with. And I can also check out the pumping service buildings, but it looks like this one at least, this one and this one, they all have vehicles still in use, 7 or 8 out of 10. And I think most of them are going to be around here. Looks like these are the only roads that are still flooded right now. So I will leave those buildings in for now, but pretty soon I will have to either turn them off or delete them, as they are costing us $1,600 per week, and we do have 3 of them. So it'll be good to get rid of those ones so we can save a little bit of money. We can also go back into our budget. Looks like sorry, I'm going to close that again. It looks like we don't have any issues with our city services anymore. If you'll recall, we were having issues with garbage and police and things like that. And it looks like the majority of those icons, if not all of them, have actually gone away now. So I will go back into the budget panel, and I'm actually going to just put everything back down to 100%. And we're going to also have to start dealing with the cleanup after the disaster. So there are a number of abandoned buildings that we have. And unfortunately, because I'm not playing with mods, I'm going to have to go through and delete all of these buildings. We do also have a number of buildings that have been searched and are ready to rebuild. And as I mentioned previously, these buildings will actually rebuild on their own once the demand for that building type increases. And a neat trick that I did learn when going around to delete these abandoned buildings, if you go into the electricity menu down at the bottom, because these abandoned buildings aren't receiving any electricity, they show up when you click on this menu as grayed out. So the buildings that are blue are active buildings that are receiving electricity, but the ones that are grayed out actually aren't receiving any electricity. So it makes it a little bit easier to go through and find the buildings that are abandoned and deleting them. So another issue that we are running into is that our commercial buildings are requiring workers, either not enough workers or not enough educated workers. And that is because the population of our city is about 1/3 of what it was before. So unfortunately, again, this is something that we just kind of have to wait and have our population increase before the commercial buildings are actually satisfied. So I'm going to go through now, and I'm going to just delete everything, and we are going to give our city a little bit of time to recover. The problem with lack of workers is starting to spread into our office buildings, and we're starting to see a large number of abandoned buildings due to that issue. Luckily though, we're starting to see an influx of people into our city. We're looking at about 100 people per week moving in, which is a good sign. But unfortunately, they're going to have to work through the education system before they become highly educated citizens and can actually work in some of these office buildings. So for now, I will continue to go through and delete these abandoned buildings. And what I've actually started doing now is I've actually started dezoning some of the areas where the abandoned buildings are. And the reason for that is if I leave them zoned in, we'll have new buildings pop up and then become abandoned and have to be deleted again. So it's becoming a little bit of a cycle. So instead of waiting for that to happen, I've just been dezoning the buildings. And then once we start getting demand for that zone type, I will put that in. So unfortunately, still, all we have to do now is we just have to wait, and we have to wait for citizens to move in, become educated, and become available to work in our offices and commercial buildings. Our city is about as stable as we could hope for at this point. We are no longer seeing any issues with our city services, and we are no longer seeing any issues with buildings being abandoned due to lack of workers or lack of educated workers. The icons that we're still seeing spread throughout the city are the disaster response icons that are showing us the buildings that have been searched and are ready to be rebuilt. As I mentioned earlier, these buildings will actually be automatically rebuilt as the demand for that building type rises. Now our city is a little bit more sparse than when we started, and one of the reasons for that is I've actually been dezoning a lot of the areas that had abandoned buildings. And I've been doing that in order to give us a little bit more control as to when these buildings are going to be rebuilt. We are still losing a little bit of money, about $80,000 per week, but we do have around $4.5 million in the bank. And if we had no money at all, or we were actually in a deficit, I wouldn't be worried at this point because I've actually not spent any money for quite some time. The last time I think I spent money was actually during the tsunami itself, when we were rebuilding the critical infrastructure buildings that I mentioned. So these buildings are marked by the disaster response icons with the red and orange background. So as I said before, and I'm going to say it again, it's very important that as your city is being struck by a disaster, that you go through your city actively and look for those buildings in order to rebuild them while you still have money. What I've been doing for the last little while, destroying abandoned buildings and rezoning areas, actually costs me no money at all. So basically, if you have the general infrastructure of your city stabilized, you will be able to rebuild it at no cost at all, because if it was working before the disaster, you can get it to work afterwards. However, if you were having money issues and you absolutely needed to rebuild something, what you could do is you could actually play around with the taxes of your city. If we go into the economy panel and we go into the taxes tab, what we can actually do is we can increase the taxes to their maximum and then just let the game run for a little bit. Eventually, we're going to see some of these tax icons start to turn red, and that's when you know that you've left your taxes on too high for too long. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to pause the game, I'm going to go back and I'm going to reduce our taxes back down to 12%. And if you look it down at the bottom, you can see that we're actually now gaining a profit of $53,000 per week. So what you can do is you can actually fluctuate your taxes to really high, back down to normal every once in a while, and hopefully eventually start to gain a little bit of a profit and dig yourself out of the hole and start to rebuild some of the parts of your city if you absolutely need to. Now we're still gaining citizens into our city, about 400 people per week. So again, all we need to do now is we just need to wait for our citizens to start moving in. We need to wait for them to become educated, and we just need to rezone some of the areas of our city. It's been a little while, about 6 years, $12 million, and around 2/3 of our population later, we're about where we were before the tsunami hit. And don't worry, we didn't lose 2/3 of our population directly to the tsunami. Unfortunately, it was around 2,000 people, but we lost the majority of our citizens from them actually abandoning their buildings and moving out of the city. So I'm going to go through a quick summary of the episode and talk about the steps I took to recover from this disaster. The first step is even before the disaster struck, but you should be keeping up with your disaster service coverage. As you expand your city, you should be periodically updating your disaster services so that you have enough warning before disaster strikes. Step 2 is once you get a disaster warning, you should immediately pause the game, review the disaster risk map, and plan accordingly. Depending on the type and size of the disaster, you may need to implement more disaster response units, emergency shelters, radio towers, and pumping services. At this time, you can also start implementing cost-saving measures to make sure that you have enough money to rebuild the critical infrastructure of your city. Before you unpause the game, evacuate your citizens if the disaster is serious enough to warrant their evacuation. Step 3. As the disaster is hitting the city, you should be actively going through and repairing all of the critical infrastructure while you still have money. These buildings include city services, education, public transportation, water, and electricity. They will be marked by the Disaster Response Unit icon with the red and orange background. Step 4. After the disaster is over, you should release your citizens from their emergency shelters and begin the process of trying to bring your city back to normalcy. Reduce your cost-saving measures and begin destroying abandoned buildings. To stabilize the city, you may need to dezone some commercial, residential, or office areas because the demand for them is going to be minimal. If you're unable to repair all of your critical infrastructure and you're desperate for money, you can fluctuate your taxes and try and gain some of that money back. And I'm going to include this as step 5, but it's something that you should be keeping in mind throughout the whole process. And that is the disaster and recovery process takes some time, and you shouldn't be trying to rush through it. Patience is key to trying to make sure that your city survives and is able to recover back to what it was. There are a couple policies that I didn't use and I didn't really talk about earlier, but they may help your city. These are the VIP area and fast recovery policies that are in the City Planning tab. I don't see the benefit of the VIP area policy, but if you are low on money and are worried about repairing your critical infrastructure, you could implement the fast recovery policy for your city. Obviously, this isn't the be-all end-all guide on how to survive and recover from a disaster. It's going to be different for everybody depending on what the city is like and what type of disaster it is. I'm sure there are better ways, and if you have any tips and tricks yourself, I encourage you to leave them down below in the comments to help out myself and anyone else who may be watching the video. I've had a few requests from people wanting to take a look at the city, so I've uploaded it to the Steam Workshop in its current state as of this episode. It's far from complete, but in pretty decent shape, I think. And that'll be it for this episode. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate the continued support I'm getting on our city. Don't hesitate to leave a like, dislike, or a comment below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for some more Cities Skylines content, and I'll see you in the next episode.